Welcome to this Wisel DAX for Power BI tutorial. In this part of the series we're going to cover how to remove filters with the All Selected and All Except functions. The video is all about how you remove filters in your measures, and we'll start with a quick reminder of how to use the All function to do that, including how to remove specific filters. Then we'll look at how to use the All Selected function to remove all of the filters from a single visualization, and then how to use the All Except function to remove every filter from a measure except for the ones that you specify. So let's get started. To get started, I've created a new report and I've already imported all the data from our standard Excel Movies workbook. As usual, I'll drop a link in the video description so you can download this file yourself if you want to follow along with the video. And all I've done since importing the data is just tidied up the data model a little bit, and I've also made sure to hide all of the ID fields from the various tables just to make our fields list a little bit neater and tidier when we're building our visuals in the report view. For the first visual we'll create, let's add a matrix to this page, and I'm going to add a variety of fields from several different tables. So from the region table first, I'm going to drag the region field into the rows bucket, and then from the country table, I'll drag the country field and sit that below region. Then from the genre table, I'll drag the genre field and drop that below country. And then finally from the film table, I'll drag the title field and drop that just below genre. What I'd now like to do is create a basic measure that shows me the total runtime for our films. So to do that, I'm going to go to the All Measures table. I'll right click and choose New Measure. And I'm going to call this one Total Runtime. Let me just zoom in on the formula bar so we can see that a little more clearly. So Total Runtime. And this is simply going to be equal to the sum of the runtime minutes field from the film table. I can then close the round brackets and hit enter, and I can now just get rid of the delete me column to convert this table into a proper measures table. So let's get rid of the delete me column and confirm that we want to do that. And just so that we can see the results of that measure, let's drag it into the values bucket of the field well for that matrix. And then I think I might want to just bump up the font size a little bit to make this a little easier to read. So let's head over to the format pane and we'll search for the font formatting properties. And I can bump up the values font size up to 13. And let's also go with the row headers font size. Let's bump that up to 13, and maybe the column headers as well. Okay, so having done all that, if I just click away from the matrix, things should be a little easier to read, I hope. And then I'm just going to expand the last region here, and then the country of New Zealand, and then the genre called fantasy, so we can see a list of various films and their total runtimes. What I'd like to do next is show the total runtime for each individual film as a percentage of the total runtime of everything in this matrix visual. In order to do that, I've got to remove all of the filters that are applied to these individual values. And you may remember from a couple of videos ago that there's a couple of ways we can do this. We can either use the remove filters function, or we can use the all function. Let's just have a quick look at how to do that. I'm going to add a new measure to the All Measures table. And let's call this one something like Total Runtime No Filters. I'm not going to hashtag it this time though. I'm going to use the calculate function, and we're going to use our existing measure, Total Runtime. We could of course write our sum function in here again, but as we already have the measure, it makes sense to use it. And then to remove all the filters, as I say, we can either use the remove filters function, or we can use the all function instead. So for this example, I'm going to use the all function. I'm not going to pass any values to any of its parameters, so no arguments for the all function there. Close the round brackets for the calculate function, and then hit enter to create it. Now if we just add this new measure into the matrix temporarily so we can see the end results, just bear with this because it's going to make a bit of a mess of our matrix. The important thing is we can see that each individual row is showing the exact same value, the grand total of all the runtimes of everything in the visual. So if we can calculate that for every single row, we can divide the runtime of an individual film against the grand total to find out the percentage contribution. So let's just remove that new measure from the matrix just to tidy things up a little bit, and then let's add another new measure which will divide the two that we've already created. So let's call this one something like Total Runtime Percentage No Filters equals, and then we'll use the divide function to divide our total runtime, the one that is affected by all the filters, against the total runtime no filters, the one that isn't affected by any filters. We'll create that new measure, and then let's assign percentage formatting to that. And then if we add our new measure into the matrix, So total runtime percentage no filters. And then let's just change the grouping here. Let's just drill back up again to collapse everything and just focus back on New Zealand fantasy movies. We can now see the percentage contribution each individual film's runtime makes to the grand total of the entire visual. Next, I'd like to add some slicers to this page so that we can filter the results of the matrix even further. So let's just click away from the matrix first and then add a slicer visual to the page. And into this first one, I'm going to add the Oscar nominations field. Then I'll add a second slicer, and to this one I'm going to assign the Oscar wins field. And then just before we start applying any filters, I'd like to add a couple of cards to help explain what values are being displayed in this matrix. So I'm going to add a card that will first of all show us our total runtime measure. So that's the original one, just the basic sum of runtime minutes. So that one will be affected by all filters. And then just below that, let's add a second card, and to this one we'll assign the total runtime no filters. So currently they both display the exact same values. Now, if we look at the matrix, if we just pick a few of the figures displayed here, we can see that this 100% in the bottom right-hand corner is being generated by dividing 143,500, I'll abbreviate it to 144,000, by 144,000. So it's the total runtime of the filtered results by the total runtime of the unfiltered results. We can take that down a level if we have a look here at the value 0.74%. This is being generated by dividing the number 1062 against the total runtime no filters, 144,000. And similarly, to an individual film level, The Lord of the Rings Return of the King, 0.14% is 201 divided by 144,000. So what happens if we start applying filters using our slicers? What things in the matrix will change? Let's increase the Oscar nominations value, the minimum value, up to 1. So we're now going to remove any films from the matrix that were not nominated for any Oscars. So we'll see a few things will change. Our total runtime filtered will give us just over 69,000. So we can see now that the grand total percentage is generated by dividing 69,000 by 144,000. You'll see that the runtime for an individual film, of course, hasn't changed. The film's runtime is the film's runtime. That's unaffected by this Oscar nominations filter. So 0.14%, this is still being generated by dividing 201 by 144,000. So it's being divided by the unfiltered value, not the filtered total. Finally, in this particular example, because all of the films in this particular category have received at least one Oscar nomination, we still retain all of these films in the group, so the grand total runtime for that filtered group is still 1062, and we're still dividing that by the grand total runtime with no filters, so the percentage is still 0.74%. If we just do one more quick example here, I'm going to increase the minimum Oscar wins up to 1. So now we're showing films in this matrix, only those that have won at least one Oscar. So you can hopefully see this time we've reduced the number of films in this particular group. And of course, naturally, we will have reduced the grand total runtime of films in the matrix as well. So this percentage figure here in the bottom right-hand corner is 34,000 divided by 144,000, roughly. The runtime for an individual film, of course, still hasn't changed. The fact that it's won an Oscar doesn't affect its runtime, so that's still 201 divided by 144,000, still 0.14%. But now, because the number of items in this group has changed, the number of total runtime for all the items in the group has been reduced to 558. So this is now 0.39%, which is 558 divided by 144,000. Now, if you're still awake after that last explanation, you may be wondering how we could adjust this measure so that we're not always dividing the runtime minutes by the grand total unfiltered runtime, but dividing each runtime minute by the total runtime minutes included in the visual. So what that would mean is I'd need to be able to produce this value on each individual row of this matrix to perform the correct division. And in order to do that, I'd need to remove all of the filters currently applied within the matrix visual, but keep the filters applied externally to the visual. So I'd need to remove the title, genre, country and region filters, but keep everything else. We have a couple of approaches to do that. If we remember from a couple of videos ago, we looked at using either the remove filters or the all function to remove specific filters. So just to demonstrate that, let's make a copy of our total runtime no filters measure, and then I can paste this code into a new measure, and I'll change its name so it says something like total runtime remove specific filters, and I'll attempt to spell this remotely correctly. There we go, remove specific filters. So currently we're removing all of the filters applied to this sum of runtime minutes. Let's say I only wanted to remove the filter applied by the film title. If I say all, film, and then refer to the title field within there, that will remove just that one single specific filter. Now remember, you can always replace the all function with the remove filters function. They're completely interchangeable here. So what this would do for each of the films in the fantasy genre for New Zealand, this would return the number 558. It might be a little tricky to demonstrate this, but let's give it a go. If I create that measure, then I'm going to drag the measure into the matrix, which is going to make a bit of a mess of it again. But if we can just drill upwards and then get back to New Zealand and then fantasy movies, hopefully we can see that each individual film, and yes, I agree that it's showing invalid films here, but every single one of those films is showing the same number, the total runtime minutes for fantasy films in New Zealand with these filters applied. Taking this a bit further, we can simply start unpicking the other filters applied to that same value. So let's remove the genre filter next. I can go back to that same measure, and then I can add a comma after removing the film title filter, and then say all, and then go for the genre field. Okay, so if we have a quick look at the total for New Zealand, if I just quickly enter this new measure, or the adjusted version of the measure, you can hopefully see in the background that that would have been the grand total for all the films in New Zealand with these filters applied. So 745 displayed next to every single row. Next, we can unpick the next level of filter, which would be the country, and then finally the region. So let's do these a little more quickly. I'm just going to quickly copy and paste these lines. So I want to remove two more filters. I want to remove the country filter and then the region filter as well. So when I enter that measure again, that should produce next to every single film on every single row the grand total runtime of everything in this visual, but still affected by the filters external to the measure, to the visual. The final step here, of course, will be to divide the total runtime by the results of this new measure. So let's just quickly do that to get our percentage of the visual total. I'm going to quickly copy and paste the total runtime percentage no filters measure, and then paste that into a new measure, and call this one total runtime percentage visual total. And then, rather than dividing it by the total runtime no filters, we'll divide this by the total runtime remove specific filters. So when we create this measure, let's just apply the percentage formatting to that as well. Then we can remove from the matrix, we can get rid of the total runtime remove specific filters, and then add our total runtime percentage visual total. And then we can see the grand total percentage in the bottom right hand corner there is 100%. Let's just drill things back up again so we can make more sense of this, and then expand down to the fantasy films in New Zealand. So the grand total is always going to be 100% because we're dividing the grand total runtime for the visual by the grand total runtime for the visual. So without any title, genre, country or region filter applied. But the important thing is that we can see now that the percentage totals for the different groups. So for fantasy films in New Zealand, we're getting 1.64%, which is 558 divided by nearly 34,000, rather than 558 divided by 144,000, which is what the 0.39% is calculating. Now, the ability to remove specific filters is a very useful one, as it allows you to be very flexible in terms of the values you're comparing. Just as a quick example before we move on, let's say we wanted to adjust this previous measure so that it shows the runtimes as a percentage of the total for each country, rather than as a percentage of the total for the entire visual. To do that, we can just modify the total runtime remove specific filters measure. If we take away the all functions which remove the filters from country and region, and only remove the filters from film and genre instead, you'll see that these percentage figures change to show the percentage of the total for the country that the row belongs to, rather than to the entire measure. So the total for fantasy films contributes nearly 75% of the total runtime for the country of New Zealand. So that's all pretty clever and useful. You can be very flexible about the values you're comparing. For this example though, I'm not really interested in removing specific filters. I just want to remove all the filters applied by any field in this visual, but keep any filters applied externally using things like slicers or explicit filters in the filters pane. And to do that, I don't have to list out every single column that I want to remove filters from. There's a much easier way to do it. I'm just going to quickly copy my total runtime remove specific filters and then create a new measure based on that. And then I'm going to paste that in, and I'm going to call this one total runtime remove. I'm going to call it internal filters. I'll tell you what, let's call it remove visual filters. So we're going to remove any filter applied by any field within the visual. And to make this work, all we need to do is use a function called allSelected. So if you use the allSelected function without passing any arguments to it, it removes all of the filters applied within the visual that the measure finds itself within. So if I create that new measure, and then just to save a bit of time, I'm going to adjust our total runtime percentage visual total. So I'm going to divide the total runtime with the total runtime remove visual filters, the one we've just created there. So when we enter this, we should see that these figures go back to their original percentages. So these are the percentage contributions for the runtimes to the grand total of the visual. So you should see again that as we adjust the values in the slicers, that these values will now update again. So if I just remove all of my filters, we go back to having exactly the same results as where we're dividing by the measure that removes all the filters. But as I add new filters in, we can see that these figures now change again, adjusting to the external filters, but ignoring any internal filters. Using the allSelected function also means that we don't need to change the measure if we decide to change which fields we include in the visual. Just to quickly demonstrate that, if I select this matrix, let's get rid of the total runtime and total runtime percentage no filters. So we're just left with the final measure we've created there. Then into the columns bucket, I'd like to insert a new field which will generate new filters. Let's add the certificate field into the columns bucket. Now, if we were removing specific filters, we'd then need to adjust our measure to include another filter in the calculate function to remove the filters from the certificate field. But with the allSelected function, that will always remove all the filters applied within the visual, so it automatically removes the filters applied by the new field we've just created. There's one final function I'd like to quickly talk about which can help to remove filters when you're performing these sorts of calculations. To demonstrate this, I'm just going to create a duplicate of page 1 by right-clicking on it and choosing Duplicate Page. And then I'm just going to adjust the way this matrix looks. I'm going to get rid of the certificate field from the columns area, and then I'm just going to reduce the width of that to give me a bit of space to add a couple of extra slicers. So I'm going to add a new slicer that's going to show me the release year for our films. So from the film table, I'm going to go to the release date and then the date hierarchy, and then drag the year field into that slicer. And then below that one, I'd like to add another new slicer, and this one's going to use the studio field from the studio table. So we can add that one in there as well. And there we go, there's the basic matrix and page setup. For the next example, I'd like a measure to calculate the total runtime, ignoring all filters except for those applied by the Oscar nominations and the Oscar wins. So that's going to involve this time removing not only the filters applied internally to the matrix, but also a couple applied externally as well. Now we could take the same approach we looked at earlier on of removing specific filters and add a couple of extra all or remove filters functions to get rid of the filters applied by Studio and Year. But that's a bit of a long-winded approach and there's a better way to do it. Let's just select our total runtime remove visual filters measure, and I'm going to quickly copy and then paste that into a new measure. I'm going to change the name of this one so that it's called Total Runtime Oscars Only, or Oscar Filters Only, something along those lines. Oscars Only I think will do for this example. Rather than using the All Selected function, I'm going to replace that with the All Except function. And as the name suggests, the All Except function removes all the filters except for the ones you specify. So in the All Except function I can refer to a table name, and then list out the columns that I want to remove, or sorry, beg pardon, keep the filters on. So I'm removing everything except for the ones I list here. So I'm going to keep the Oscar nominations filter and keep the Oscar wins filter as well. So I can enter that measure. Rather than displaying that in the matrix and having this annoying view again, I'm just going to jump straight to the next stage and divide the original total runtime by this new one that I've just created. So I'm just going to once again copy and paste an existing measure, total runtime percentage visual total, paste that into a new measure and call this one total runtime percentage Oscars only, or Oscar filters only, something like that. If you can think of a better name for it, please feel free to use it. So all I need to do here is add just the denominator. That's going to be the total runtime Oscars only. I can then enter that measure and apply the percentage formatting to it. And then I'm going to add this one in side by side with my existing measure to that matrix. I may not have left myself quite enough space. Let's just see if we can adjust these column widths to make things a little easier to read. There we go. So at the moment, both of these measures produce exactly the same results. The only filters we currently have applied which are affecting them either come from directly within the matrix based on the region, country, genre and title fields, or they come from the Oscar nominations and Oscar wins fields which we've explicitly mentioned in the All Except function. Just to make this a little clearer, I'm going to change this second card so that it shows the total runtime Oscars only. So again, you can see the same end result. And if I change the values displayed in these slices, let's change Oscar wins down to 1 and Oscar nominations down to 1, you can see that these two results match exactly again. Let's just change the way the matrix looks again. I'm going to drill back up again and then drill back down into New Zealand films, so we've got some familiar looking values to look at. Let's expand the adventure genre there as well. So everything matches because we've only applied filters using either something from internally within the matrix or using the explicitly mentioned fields in the All Except function. So what happens if we apply a filter using a different field, one that's external to the matrix but isn't mentioned in the All Except function? Let's scroll down the studio list and find Wingnut Films. Now Wingnut Films was responsible for all 4 films listed here in New Zealand, King Kong and the 3 Lord of the Rings films. If I select Wingnut Films, you can hopefully see a big difference now in the end results. Have a look at the total runtime for the standard sum of runtime minutes. That's affected by this studio field. So these values here in the original measure, the percentage of the visual total, are dividing the runtimes of each film by the total runtime 745. Whereas the new measure that we've created, the runtime percentage Oscars only, doesn't care what studios we've selected. It's still reading the total runtime as 34,000, so it hasn't adjusted the percentage contribution of each film. That's still affected only by the Oscar nominations and Oscar wins slicers. We have a similar effect if we apply a filter using the year slicer. Let's reduce that down to 2002. So that will cut out a couple of extra films. So now we've only got the last 2 Lord of the Rings films. So now the contribution is each film's runtime divided by 357. Whereas the value for the new measure we've created isn't affected by that at all because we haven't explicitly listed it in the All Except function. So there you go, there's how to use the all selected and all accept functions to remove filters in your measures. Hope you found some of that useful. Thanks very much for watching and for staying awake if you did. See you next time.